Welcome to AUC Author Series. In this series of programs, we interview the authors in the Atlanta University Center community and introduce you to their latest published works. This program is produced by Brad Ost and Daniel Lee.
Our guest today is Dr. Michael Janis, Associate Professor of English at Morehouse College. Dr. Janis teaches literary theory, Western African novel, perspectives on the Americas, world literature, and composition. His research interests include African fiction and film, post-colonial theory, literature and philosophy, feminism, Latin American fiction, and Caribbean fiction.
Good afternoon. My name is Yolanda Gilmore Bivens, and I am a librarian at the Woodruff Library. And I'm here this afternoon to interview one of the faculty with our work, which is Dr. Michael Janis. He is at Morehouse College in the Department of English. And we're going to speak with him today about his latest title, Africa After Modernism, Transitions in Literature, Media, and Philosophy. Welcome, Dr. Janis.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So to get started, the first thing we'd like to do is just ask you to give us an overview of your book. Just tell us a little bit about it.
Okay, well, this book is an effort to examine key transitions in Africa in terms of literature, media, and philosophy. Modernism, in the title, indicates the movement of modernism, but as well a quest for modernity in Africa. And the book begins with a kind of excavation of European modernist works on Africa with a focus on Michel Leiris and Alejo Carpentier, and moves on to a chapter on Yambo Lugum's famous novel, the Malian novelist called Bound to Violence, Le Devoir de Violence, and concludes with, goes on to another chapter on media, the image of Africa in the Western media, and concludes with a chapter on Africana philosophy. There is an overview in the beginning of the book on Africana modernisms, various approaches to literature and arts in Africa and in the diaspora. Some excellent works on that subject had been undertaken recently by authors like Sharpley Whiting's Negritude Women, Brent Hayes's Practices of Diaspora, and this book is very much concerned with suturing, if you will, various philosophical and cultural questions that arise in terms of the European modernist interaction with Africa and Africa's response. So it was a laborious undertaking, but one that I hope in the end achieved a certain thesis on Africa and its interaction with modernist figures.
So tell me, how did you get started on this particular topic? Why did you choose this field of study?
Well, my specialties are, I originally started working with continental philosophy. Okay. Moved on in graduate school in my doctoral program to have a focus on post-colonial theory with really two subspecialties, Latin American and Caribbean, and then especially focusing on West African literature. I later took West African film as part of my focus. So this book has been a culmination of many years of work. The work on Michel Leiris as an avant-garde ethnographer, and the work on Alejo Carpentier as also an avant-garde Cuban thinker, I began many years ago, and really in recent years have had a strong focus on Africana philosophy as a undertaking. And so I sought to look at that certain period of early 20th century Africa's response to it and the modernist thought, and to move on to the 21st century and the image of Africa in the media.
Michael, many times when you've come to the library with your students, you've had them do research, particularly on Equinado and Césaire. Can you tell me why and how that is worked into, or how that comes from the works that you do in your own research from the book?
Part of my pedagogy at Morehouse is to give the students an experience in African letters and literature, and of course an experience in the place of Africa in world culture. And there are many authors that I regularly sign, that are some of our intellectual heroes at Morehouse, such as Du Bois and Martin Luther King. Equiano, I think, is one of the a very interesting place to start. Alauda Equiano wrote in 1789 his interesting life, his great narrative about growing up in what is today the Igbo region of Nigeria, and his slavery and his freedom. He was, such a remarkable figure. His book was so successful. It was, he had several book tours, which was an incredible accomplishment for someone who had been a slave in the Americas. He is, by many authors, Henry Louis Gates calls him a first exemplar of double consciousness. He is a very interesting writer to begin with. On the other end of the spectrum, Aimé Césaire and Negritude, and many other Francophone African intellectuals are part of my pedagogy, because students are so regularly exposed to the Booker T. Washingtons and Du Boises, and not the Aimé Césaires and Leopold Senghors and so many other writers. But the main point that I make in pedagogy is that students. I hope that students will understand the diversity of Africa, a continent with 1,500 languages, perhaps even more, depending on linguistic categories, and that they will come to appreciate African literatures and cultural accomplishments. And those are two authors that enable us to begin very well with those questions.
Okay, one other thing that we typically go over in your classes is you have them find images, typically from Africa. Talk a little bit about what it is you want them to learn when you look at those images, look at that media from Africa, as in contrast to the media that comes from from the United States. Talk a little bit about that.
That's an excellent question. And so many students, when we begin to study Africa in the media, and we do so sometimes in various classes, they want to know, why do we see so many negative images of Africa? And when we study colonialism, we have to ask ourselves, the question of what do we understand, what can we understand about pre-colonial Africa? And these are complex questions that theorists debate. African intellectuals have debated for decades, the level to which colonialism eradicated certain African cultures, the level to which they have persisted. Many consider colonialism just a brief sliver of African history. Others have said that the tragedies of slavery and colonialism have inevitably altered African history. But for students to understand the image of Africa, I think they do need this breadth of African history, which should teach us that before slavery and colonialism, Africa had many democratic cultures,
sure.
had many cooperative cultures, societies, but that Africa was not one thing. There were, of course, empires in Africa, empires built by violence, and that's what a book like Yambo Lubon's Bound to Violence teaches us. There's this complexity of the period. But I hope students, when they look at images, first of all, they understand that there's not something such as an innately positive or negative image. That's a simplistic approach to reading images, and that representation is, as someone like Stuart Holland and cultural studies theorists would say, it's constitutive of understanding, of representation. Interpretation is constitutive. And students need a background in order to be able to what we say, we call read images. And so when we pick up the issue of the media, for example, we have to ask ourselves, how can we blame the media? In what ways can we blame them? Well, first of all, my study of the media in Africa, and as someone who worked for a wire service in the mid-'90s in Abidjan, in Cote d'Ivoire, I would say that we can put a lot of blame on the media. In other words, the chief criticism has been the issue of crisis is news, what we call crisis reporting, the superficiality of reports in Africa, coup d'etats, sickness, violence, assassinations, etc. But there's also this long-standing role of the media as gadfly, as critic, and so part of the media's role is to report, very images that we would consider negative. The problem is when you have a sheer repetition of only negative images, you don't students are not exposed to African cities, African educational systems, African culture, only child soldiers, blood diamonds, and disease. So it's that process that so many Africana thinkers have talked about, and King expresses so well, of that building up of an identity, an African identity that goes beyond these negative images. But once we get there, we realize that there cannot be some sort of simplistic notion of positive or negative in the press.